the public input forum, and I think things look a little differently. But hopefully everybody's able to hear me. And with that, I would like to turn it over to the folks at LUS, and they will kind of introduce things, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Mike. For everyone, this is Jeff Stewart, Engineering and Power Supply Manager. And before we get kicked off, I want to turn it over to Lowell Duyon to have some opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is Lowell Duyon, Interim Director of Lafayette Utilities. I want to welcome everyone to this very important forum. I understand that you guys are taking time out of your day for this, and we really appreciate it, but this is a very, very important deal. I also want to thank our friends over at Burns & McDonnell for this opportunity and for this forum. I'm going to turn this back on over to Jeff. Jeff, thank you for your work that you've done on this thing. I understand it's been going on for over a year, so we really appreciate it. Mike's yours. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Lowell. So as we get started, this is how the presentation is going to happen. Our presentation team, that's my wonderful picture there on the left. Mike Borgstadt, who's going to be moderating as well and facilitating this, and Kyle Combs has been a big part of this project moving forward. What you don't see on this slide are the dozens and dozens of people behind the scenes who have worked on this project for over a year now. And I think the results of this study and the process and the analysis, it all points back to those people both at the LUS side and on the Burns & Mac team. Also have to give credit to our customers and our interaction with our stakeholders over the last year plus. I think that we're getting really close to the end here, and we're able to present something I think that's beneficial for LUS and its customers. So today's presentation, it's going to be a short presentation, about 40 or so total slides. It's going to give some high-level review of the analysis itself. For everyone, be aware that the Integrated Resource Plan will be published at a later date, and it's very thorough. It's data-driven. It has a lot of assumptions included in it. We may not be able to touch on every piece of data tonight because we wanted to hit the high points, but just know that we've seen a lot of the data already, the drafts and the different sections, and it's thorough. And so I think everyone will be pleased with how complete it is. We have been receiving questions, written questions prior to tonight's meeting. We have some compiled with some answers that we're going to be ready to provide at the end of the presentation. And during the presentation, we'll also be fielding questions, not to answer then, but compiling the questions throughout tonight's presentation. And then following our slideshow, we will answer those questions as time permits. Two options to submit. Like I said, we've been receiving some questions already. You can continue sending questions to the irpfeedback@lus.org location, or via the chat function that should be included on your screen. How to submit a question. Again, this is just kind of a follow-up for that chat function. You should see it available. We have several members of our staff compiling those throughout the evening. And if we don't get to any questions tonight live, we will respond to the questions in writing. We also will compile a list of all questions, answer those as completely as we can, and post them to our website at a later date. With that, I will turn it back over to Mike Borgstadt, and he will run through a majority of the presentation.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks again for everybody joining us. I know that this looks a little bit different than our previous two presentations, but we're now living in a COVID world, so I guess luckily we have the technology to able to facilitate sharing of the information and presentation in a little bit different manner. So hopefully this works for everyone. Here's our agenda. Like Jeff said, we have about 40 slides. Hopefully I'll talk fairly quickly and we'll get through this in about 30 or 40 minutes, and then kind of turn it over to some of the Q&A as Jeff mentioned. But really just talk a little bit about, give you a little bit of background again on Burns & Mac, get right to the meat of kind of some of the conclusions and recommendations that we've seen, and then explain how we kind of got there, and then again, we'll follow up with those Q&A and the opportunity for feedback. So just a little bit of an introduction to Burns & Mac and who we are. Burns & McDonnell is one of the largest engineering, construction, and consulting companies in the United States. We're in the top 10 as Engineering News of Record it ranks companies in that space. So we really dabble in a lot of different infrastructure projects, from oil, gas, and chemical projects to architectural projects. But here, what we're talking about here is power supply and power delivery in the electricity world. And we do a lot of different work with, nuclear power, wind farms, solar facilities, gas-fired generation, energy storage, you name it, we're pretty much involved with it. And so we help a lot of clients wade through what their decisions are, and that's what we're here talking about today. But we also, as being a large construction and engineering company, we have the ability to execute on those projects, and we build a lot of those types of facilities. So having that intimate knowledge with how facilities are designed and constructed and operated and how we plan for them really, at least we'll brag a little bit about ourselves, feel that we bring the knowledge to help LUS and really appreciate LUS trusting us to help them again with the IRP. So with that, we'll kind of get straight into it, and hopefully a lot of you were able to review the pre-presentation slides. So these next few slides are exactly what was distributed to many of you that pre-registered for this. So you've already seen these. So these shouldn't be anything new to you, but for those that are new to it and maybe didn't have time to review it, we wanted to cover those. And really what I like to do is kind of show you guys where we're going in this presentation, just so it gives you an idea of the information that's going to be presented. So we have about 9, I think, conclusions and recommendations here that we'll go through. But really one of the main ones is LUS should continue to maintain a well-diversified portfolio for power generation. And this is going to consist of both dispatchable resources, which are typically gas-fired or coal-fired resources, a dispatchable resource that provides great reliability to the system, but also couple that with a lot of renewable resources that are going to provide that lower-cost energy, emission-free, carbon-free resources. So having that combination of everything, just like financial advisors tell us to do, is have a well-diversified portfolio for retirement. LUS continuing to maintain a well-diversified power generation portfolio makes sense. One of the other things that we've seen is low capacity costs, and I'm going to be using a lot of different terms that's used in the utility world, but short-term capacity resources have been very, very low cost, as well as some of the midterm and long-term resources. But really what we want to look at is LUS should continue to procure short-term capacity resources to fill deficits needed to meet their resource adequacy. You can do that through power purchase agreements. Certainly when you're taking a look at longer-term resources, power purchase agreements or LUS-owned resources also kind of come into the mix. What we've seen based on this evaluation is the long-term coal-fired operation of Rodemacher Power Station 2, or RPS-2 as we may call it, does not appear economical. And this is due to a significant number of items. One of those, investment associated with environmental compliance, as well as just ongoing operation, the unit's getting older, and associated maintenance costs. So one thing that we wanted to talk about is really the focus of this evaluation wasn't necessarily picking today what RPS-2 is going to be replaced with, but knowing that RPS-2 is going to come to an end, what decisions and things does LUS need to be doing in the next several years to position itself to start moving away from coal-fired generation to something else. And based on the analysis that we've done, we're recommending that LUS should consider retirement around the 2027 timeframe to avoid those investments required for coal-fired operation. Now, one of the things that many people know is the decision to retire a coal-fired unit, or any unit for that matter, is going to require a lot of work with other people. LUS is a joint owner of that facility with 2 other entities. So really, LUS is going to have to work with those joint owners. You're going to have to work with individual governing body, such as the council, environmental, state, regulatory, and MISO approvals are all required to retire these units, or this specific unit. So really what LUS needs to be doing is working with those other owners, those other entities that we named, of how do we start to evaluate the end of life for RPS2. And there's a couple different options, and we'll get into it, but do they get retired altogether from electric generation? Or do you just look at retiring it from coal operation and converting it to natural gas? Different options that are available. Again, you have to work with the joint owners. If RPS2 is retired from generation altogether, which means it's no longer going to be a power plant, one of the options that looks favorable is a self-build simple cycle gas turbine that would be about just over 200 megawatts. LUS has the existing Dock Bonham facility that may be suitable for repurposing and building that simple cycle. So one of the things that we're recommending is, again, we're not making the decision to build this plant today or in the next couple weeks as we're finalizing the report. Really what we're taking a look at is what are the next steps to be able to attack that type of a resource option if needed. And then obviously before you do anything with a long-term power supply decision, we really want to have LUS considering other power purchase agreements that may be available, when RPS2 retires, that may serve as an alternative to that self-build option. You want to keep all your options open and do what's in the best interest of the customers. LUS should consider addition of renewable resources. And again, we'll get into this, but really specifically solar appears to be a resource that could be added and help mitigate costs and keep costs low. You would do those through most likely through a power purchase agreement. The way that the Congress has set up, the U.S. Congress has set up the tax incentives for this. You receive either production tax credits or investment tax credits. LUS is not a for-profit entity; they're a municipal utility, so they don't have the ability to take advantage of those credits. So, in order to take advantage of those credits, doing a third-party transaction with a power purchase agreement, where a third party can take advantage of those tax agreements and reduce the cost of solar to LUS, would be beneficial. So, one of the things that we would recommend doing is consider issuing a power supply RFP to get bids for capacity and energy with an emphasis on solar. And then the last two are just really what we want to do is LUS just needs to continue to monitor the overall electric industry, especially around regulations that are going to impact power supply. But really what we want to focus on are those emerging technology improvements that we're going to see from energy storage and other renewable resources such as offshore wind. There's continued development there. It's not really prominent yet in the United States. As those types of things evolve and get maybe more cost effective, that may be great power supply sources in the future. And then LUS should just continue to review and reassess its power supply plan periodically. So one of the things that kind of wanted to introduce is the term balance of loads and resources, or BLR. So one of the things that we talked about is RPS2 is going to retire from coal-fired generation. And that's going to leave it a pretty large capacity deficit in the future, which is indicated by this orange shading here. But what I really want to do is maybe describe what this chart is a little bit. So what a resource plan is doing is trying to mix and match all these different resources with the needs. So LUS has this dotted black line represents LUS's peak demand, that hottest summer day during the year, not the hottest summer day, but one of the hot summer days where everybody's air conditioning is on. We have the most, highest demand for electricity at that one single hour. Well, the system doesn't always work perfect, so what we have to do is have reserves on top of that. And the black line represents the reserve margin needed, because we need redundancy in the system, because we don't, the United States electrical system is very robust, very reliable, where there's upsets on the transmission system or the power supply system. We don't even notice it at our homes a lot of times. And that's due to that redundancy. Well, the bars down here represent LUS's resources. And here we show from 2021 to 2040 was the study period that we looked at. So you can see the gray bars here represent Rodemacher Power Station 2 being retired at the end of 2027 and 2028. So now we have a large deficit that we have to fill. And as I showed before, that's the orange area. So we have to fill that in with capacity resources. But as you also see, is LUS has positioned itself very wisely to be slightly deficit right now to the market, where LUS can procure low-cost capacity resources. Right now, there's an abundance of capacity on the system. loads have remained relatively low, and so LUS is able to go out and buy market purchases at relatively low cost to meet that short-term need. So it's balancing out the short-term and long-term need. So one of the, there's a lot of different options for replacing coal-fired generation. Basically, the plan said LUS, is going to shift away from coal-fired generation to renewables, gas, and market purchases. So the near-term deficits, as we kind of mentioned, that blue shaded area on the slide before, is likely going to be taken care of through additions of solar generation and then those short-term capacity purchases. One of the things that we'll highlight, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is all of these paths. There were numerous paths that we evaluated. These were the 4 that kind of sifted to the top. But all of these paths had several things that were in common. One was the addition of a lot of different solar generation early on from 2021 to 2025, totaling up to 250 megawatts of solar generation. And as you see, each of those paths also has Rodemacher retiring from coal in 2027 or even outright altogether and replacing it with a natural gas-fired resource. So the one thing that we have is a large capacity gap that will have to be filled in 2028. And the most economical way to do that under today's conditions is through new gas-fired dispatchable resources. So that gives you a highlight of kind of where we're going to go. And now we'll, talk a little bit more about, how we got there and some of the data and other things and analysis that we're doing. So bear with me a little bit. We had 2 previous presentations, and I know probably many of the people here listening today have seen these slides, but for anybody new, we wanted to, at least briefly cover these a little bit just to give you a little background on the IRP process. So really the pillars of a utility mission statement, or what does a utility really set out to do, regardless of the utility type, but it's really to provide low-cost, reliable, safe, and environmentally compliant or environmentally friendly energy is really what we're trying to do in the utility industry. The utility industry is heavily regulated. There's a ton of rules that utilities have to do. LUS obviously has to follow these rules too. We've thrown a few of the entities up here, NERC, FERC, the different ISOs, EPA. So a lot of different rules that we have to follow, and that is there to ensure that we're able to provide all those things: low cost, reliable, safe, and environmentally compliant plans. So really LUS's obligations are twofold when it comes to an IRP. They have to provide enough sufficient capacity to meet demand. And so we already talked about that balance of loads and resources chart, which was really talking about capacity. So MISO, who the figure down here to the right shows the overall MISO area. So this is the market that LUS operates in. MISO sets the capacity requirements for LUS based on their load forecast and then that reserve margin. So one of the great things about participating with an entity like MISO and all the utility neighbors is you get a share in that redundancy, and that helps reduce the amount of redundancy you need on your system if you were to go it alone. So that capacity to meet that demand has to come from power plants, it can come from contracts, and it can come from demand response. Just things that, how can we make sure that our customers' needs are met, and we're able to provide reliable electricity. One thing that we talked about in previous slides is not all power plants are created equal. Some have different attributes. Some are higher cost, some are lower cost, some count for full capacity, other ones don't. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but that's just something to think about. LUS needs to provide sufficient energy to meet customers' needs, and energy can come from power generation, contracts, net metering, such as rooftop solar that's on the top of residences or commercial buildings, conservation measures, or purchases from the MISO market in order to meet those needs. And as we said, all this energy has to be compliant with regulations. There's a lot of folks, a lot of states covered by MISO. A lot of their energy has renewable mandates associated with it. Obviously, all of them have environmental regulations as being set out by the EPA, but all that energy has to be compliant. So how does electricity work? We have a fairly simplistic graphic here, but really what we're talking about is electricity gets produced at a power plant, whether it's a wind turbine, nuclear plant, coal plant, gas plant. That electricity gets transmitted over high voltage transmission lines. These are the ones that you see going down the highway. It'll go to a substation that transforms it down to a lower voltage. A lot of industries, especially oil, gas, and chemical industries, have the need for higher voltage electricity because they have very large motors. So they'll pull some electricity off of that. It continues to flow down onto the distribution network, and that's where, what most of us are used to using at our homes and our commercial buildings of getting all the way to the electricity so we can keep our phones and our TVs and everything else on. Well, things that are disrupting the traditional business model are the renewables being put on the system, as well as consumer behavior, right? We have a little car here that's plugged in, so we have a plug-in hybrid that's using energy. How do we continue to facilitate electric vehicle adoption? We have a house here that has some solar panels on it. How do we continue to incorporate additional distributed energy resources onto the system? So when you're taking a look at an IRP, there's really two sides of this whole equation we're looking at is really the power supply. The electricity generation, it has a lot of different options: coal-fired, gas-fired, wind, solar, hydro, biomass, a whole number of different ones. Those provide capacity and energy to meet our customers' needs. So really what we're trying to do is take a look at the customer's needs and make sure they're satisfied on demand and energy. Now, the one thing that we know is our customers' needs are changing. Some have rooftop solar, as I mentioned, electric vehicles, things that are changing. So this is really the focus, these two sides of the equation when it comes to an integrated resource plan. Transmission planning, distribution planning, and other rules or things are set out to make sure that the utility is planning on this side with the transmission and delivery. So just wanted to clarify that. So an integrated resource planning process is a lot of data gathering. You can see here a whole number of different factors of what we do. Well, at the end of the day, we're taking those different factors and we're developing a lot of different scenarios and sensitivities. What that means is we're looking at different futures. What is the next 20 years going to look like under low gas prices, medium gas prices, high gas prices? What does that look like under evolving technologies and different levels of technological advancement with energy storage and other things? We take all of those assumptions and those scenarios, we run an economic screening and a cost-benefit evaluation that comes out with a power supply plan. And I've already kind of alluded to this a little bit, but really the primary goal of the IRP is to provide an economic evaluation of a utility's power supply portfolio, both over the short-term and long-term planning horizons. And really what I think I want to emphasize is we need to focus on the short-term decisions. We're not trying to make a long-term decision at today or in the next couple of weeks or the next year per se, but we need to make short-term decisions that are going to position the utility for long-term success. And that's really what an IRP is trying to do. So that's a little bit of background on the IRP process. So one of the things that we did during the data gathering process is a condition assessment and environmental assessment. So wanted to touch base on those. So condition assessment is taking a look at LUS's existing resources and taking a look at how long are these resources going to last, how much is it going to cost to continue to operate and maintain these resources. You combine that with environmental assessment. Are there any investments that are going to be required that are going to be triggered by environmental compliance that needs to be done? So with overall the condition assessment, what we saw is LUS has maintained its generation fleet at or exceeding industry standards based on reliability matrix. And reliability matrix are how often can the unit turn on when it needs to turn on is essentially what it means, or how often does it trip off when you don't want it to trip off. And LUS has done a great job of maintaining its units at costs that are similar to that in the industry. So that's good. From the environmental assessment, so LUS has several different types of generation currently. They have natural gas-fired generation that's located locally in town on their system. They also have the Rodemacher Power Station Unit 2 that's a coal-fired power plant. Well, from the natural gas-fired units, based on current regulations and those that are proposed, there does not appear to be a large capital requirement needed for anything in compliance in the near future. So those units are compliant. However, that changes a little bit when we're talking about with RPS-2. There's environmental regulations facing RPS-2. There's a couple of environmental regulations that, regardless of RPS-2's long-term operation, whether it's on coal, whether it's retired, whether it's converted to natural gas, are going to be incurred. And one of those is the first one that's highlighted there, the coal combustion residue. This is a CCR, as it's known in the industry. The CCR rule was passed by EPA to start better regulating the disposal of ash on power plant sites. So overall, RPS-2 is going to have to comply with this, whether coal is retired or it's converted or continued to use. And it's going to total about $20 to $25 million for the entire RPS-2 unit. So then the joint owners will obviously have to pay their portion of that cost. The effluent limit guidelines, the next one down, or ELG, is only really, there's a lot of different fine print to a lot of the different rules, but really the purpose of this unit is if the unit continues to operate on coal, it would have to comply and change how it transports its ash currently. So ELG guidelines are basically coming up in the next several years. However, the proposed ELG rules do allow for utilities to commit to retiring a unit by December 31st, 2028 to avoid the investment in an ELG if it's going to cease operation from coal-fired generation. So this is one of the rules that LUS and the joint owners would be able to avoid the investment in. Obviously, you're not avoiding the rule, you're avoiding the investment to comply with the rule if you were to shut down from coal-fired generation. RPS-2 obviously is going to be, required to comply with numerous other air regulations and other things that are always, under periodic review and new proposals. But those are the two major environmental rules that are kind of impacting RPS's 2's operation. So as we kind of alluded to, RPS-2 is likely going to retire from coal-fired generation, and it's going to leave a significant gap in the BLR for LUS. So how do we fill that? Well, that's when you take a look at doing a new resource technology assessment. So this is looking at the new resources that are available to provide firm capacity to meet the reliability standards that are required of MISO and all the utilities out there. So the one thing that we know is all power generation is not created equal. So there are certain attributes that we're looking at when it comes to power generation. And they're listed here. Capacity, we've already kind of talked about that. That's the ability to meet customers' demand. You have to have the ability to be able to provide electricity. Well, that capacity is impacted a lot by the dispatchability of the unit. Dispatchability comes in kind of two different things: cycling and ramping. Cycling is the ability to turn on and off. Ramping is the ability to move up and down with your generation. And so these two are very, very important as the system starts to move to more intermittent resources, because as we know, the solar, the sun's out in the morning, pops up at 8 a.m. This time of year is great. It, doesn't go down till, 9 p.m. But as soon as the sun's down, we have to have resources that can fill in during the night if you have a lot of solar resources. That could either be through power plants, like natural gas-fired power plants, energy storage, or other things. But that's a very important attribute. We also want to take a look at the operations and maintenance cost associated with fuel, staffing, maintenance, and everything. The investment cost, the capital cost, or the amount of debt that LUS would have to issue in order to implement some of those costs, and then certainly the emissions when it comes to the emissions associated with that. So what technologies do we evaluate in this in the IRP? Well, one, we looked at the continued operation of RPS-2 on coal and looked at compliance with those environmental regulations and determined essentially that it was no longer economical to do that. So then what are some of the other options for replacing that? Well, you can convert the RPS-2 unit to natural gas. This would be one of the lower capital intensive projects because you already have a power plant there. You just need to get natural gas there and modify that unit to burn natural gas. There's other natural gas fired resources: a simple cycle unit, a combined cycle unit, reciprocating engine units that all provide dispatchable resources. Obviously, we have renewable resources. We looked at wind and we looked at solar resources, and then we took a look at energy storage and how that might play into, because energy storage is an emerging technology that's starting to make quite a bit of advancements. But how do you incorporate that to incorporate more wind and solar to take away that intermittency of wind and solar and the renewable resources. So that takes a look at, you know, the different power generation options that we evaluated within this, and we came up with, you know, all the different attributes associated with those to put into the model. So that kind of brings us to the power supply assessment and all the different assumptions that went into the power supply assessment. So, and basically what the power supply assessment is it's an economic evaluation, and it's an extremely robust evaluation. We're taking a look at the long-term forecasted requirements that is needed by LUS, but you have to have the ability to provide power in the real time. Just like if somebody would stand up right now and go over to their room and start flipping on and off the light, physics tells us that power generation has to move up and down with all those different light switches, and obviously on a huge power grid, it's even amplified. So we have to be able to have a long-term plan, but we also have to be able to have a plan that can provide real-time application. It's a life cycle cost consideration. We're taking a look at capital cost associated with debt. We're taking a look at the operations and maintenance cost. And then the benefits that we're looking at is what is the energy cost that we get out of that versus alternatives? What's the capacity credit that we get? And what is the emissions that we get? Because obviously some dispatchability a lot of times comes at the penalty of carbon and CO2 emissions. So we want to take a look at all that. And really the goal is to optimize a resource portfolio to meet all the customers' needs, and that's what we're trying to do. And when we say quote unquote optimize, is what we do is we're optimizing around lowest cost plan, whether that's from an MPV basis or looking at all those individual years. What we're doing is trying to come up with low cost plans that meet all of those rules and requirements that are set forth. So there were numerous power supply plans that came up. So we license a sophisticated software program. To do this, there's a handful of different programs that are used without the industry, and Burns & McDonnell licensed several of those. So we used one of our sophisticated software programs to evaluate that, and came up with all different kinds of combinations of resources and paths that were spelled out of how can we meet LUS's long-term resource needs and load. And so what we have is here's the year 2021 through 2040, a 20-year horizon. We have the paths listed here, path 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll kind of go through a little bit of the uniqueness of each of these paths. But one thing that we find in common is all the paths have RPS2 retired from coal operation. And as I mentioned, we didn't just look at 4 paths. There were multiple paths evaluated. These were the 4 that sifted to the top. So there were paths that had RPS2 continuing to operate on coal. However, those were higher cost options. So these are the more lower cost options that were evaluated. So as you noticed, most of the low cost options have RPS2 retired from coal. The other thing that was unique to all of them that was in common with all of them is all of the paths have 250 megawatts of solar generation being added between 2021 and 2025. So it's really taking a look at solar generation has come down in cost, and it's really looking at adding that energy to the LUS portfolio. Where we start to see them differ a little bit is how do you replace RPS2 once it is retired from coal? So each of these paths is a little bit different in that situation. So here we have a 227 megawatt simple cycle unit. This path has just over a 200 megawatt combined cycle unit. And just to give you a little bit of context, the RPS2 unit right now, Rodemacher Unit 2, is a 246 megawatt unit operating on coal-fired generation. Option 3 would be converting RPS2 to natural gas. As you can see, it's 240 megawatts. There's a small D rate. You can't get all the megawatts out of the unit when you convert it, but it's obviously very, very close. And then the reciprocating engine option here, which would be 10 smaller engines that are 18 megawatts each for a total of 180 megawatts. So what we do when we're doing these evaluations is, one, we're looking at all the annual costs, but we kind of boil that back to an MPV. And the chart here at the bottom shows the NPV, or net present value, heat map of each of these resources. So what you can see here, and these are all just rated against each other. We didn't rate these against any of the, I guess, what we'll call suboptimal units, for example, but these are all rated against each other. So the heat map says green is good, green is low cost, red is higher cost. And so what the first thing you'll kind of notice is, path one will just kind of work left to right, but path one is the retirement of Rodemacher 2 with the addition of a simple cycle unit. Well, under the base case option, and we ran several different cases here, base case with low demand, base case with high demand, what happens if you have high gas and market prices, or if you have low gas and market prices. So looking at different futures so we can try to make a good decision moving forward. What you notice is under the base case evaluation, the simple cycle combustion turbine is the lower cost plan. As you move up and you see, if we look at high gas and market prices, we see that the combined cycle ends up being the lowest cost plan, as highlighted across here. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, not all power plants are created equal. Well, combined cycle unit requires more investment in it. It has a higher capital cost. It has a higher purchase price. But what you get with that higher purchase price is a lot more efficiency, a lot higher heat rate, or lower heat rate, sorry, higher efficiency. So if you look at this as driving your car, a higher efficiency is equal to a lower heat rate. Well, that's equal to a higher gas mileage. So you're able to get more bang for your buck when you go to the pump. Well, under a high gas price scenario, which typically leads to high market prices, having a more fuel efficient resource, such as a combined cycle, ends up paying for itself with that trade-off of that higher investment. However, conversely, if you look at the low gas price and market, it's not necessarily as favorable, because now you're paying for an option, low heat rate, higher efficiency. You're paying for it, but you don't necessarily need it. And that's where you see RPS2 being converted to natural gas ends up being the lowest one, because this is the least capital intensive project of all of the projects up here. Because you already have a power plant, you already have a boiler, you have substation, you have everything there. However, you would have to convert it to natural gas, so that's going to cost some money. And just by the nature of the facility, you would still have a fairly large staff and a large power plant just providing capacity there. But it would be under a super low gas, low market prices future, still competitive. But overall, when you look at the heat map for the simple cycle path one, it is, relatively the one that scores best or ranks best of all of these. Again, though, we're not trying to make a decision on each of these, just trying to give you an illustration of what is going on. We're not trying to today pick which one of these is going to replace RPS2 when it's retired, but we want to be able to position ourselves to be able to execute one of those if we need to in the future. And so here's another one, just a little bit more. Of these slides will be published later, and we can be able to provide you just a little bit more of a delta between these. And you can see what this really kind of illustrates is the simple cycle is the low cost plan under all the different base cases, but even under these other two, it's only $14 to $19 million on an NPV basis, higher than these other cases. Now, one thing that you'll see, and if people remember from the 2016 IRP, reciprocating engines were one of the resources that fell out of that as a desirable resource that may be a good fit in LUS's portfolio. However, that was a 50 megawatt to 60 megawatt recip engine, and reciprocating engines at the 50 to 60 megawatt range, when you only have a small need of 50 to 60 megawatts, are extremely competitive. However, when you get into needing over 200 to 250 to 300 megawatts when you retire the RPS2 unit, that is a lot larger of a chunk of capacity, so that these other resources become much, much more cost competitive due to economies of scale. So that's why you're seeing a little bit of a change from the previous IRP, where the need was only 50 megawatts versus a need of over 300 megawatts, as we showed from that BLR previously. And on the next slide here. So again, this is the exact same slide that we showed earlier, after RPS2 is retired, you have a deficit of over 300 megawatts. So you're going to have to fill that in again. And so what does that look like? And I'm going to use path 1 as an example with the simple cycle unit. With the simple cycle unit and solar additions. So what we see is the solar additions are illustrated here with the yellow shading as we fill in the deficits. So the short-term deficits are filled by solar generation as well as market capacity. So LUS has positioned itself to add these resources. So then when we see Rodemacher Power Station 2 retire in 2027, we need a large resource in 2028. That's what's being illustrated here by the simple cycle. Again, no, we're not saying that that's going to be the resource, but just for illustration purposes, fills in that gap, and you still have the ability and the need to add market capacity. Well, what this is going to do is this is going to allow LUS to be flexible with how it's going to meet that future need. Maybe energy storage becomes more cost competitive in the future, and that can be offset by that. There's a whole host of other, emerging technologies. So it's a positioning LUS to, have good dispatchable resources to meet all the rules and regulations set forth, but also have the ability and flexibility to continue to add renewables as they need it, or energy storage as it becomes more prevalent. So again, taking a look at the timeline and keeping in mind we're trying to make short-term decisions here to position the utility for long-term success. So here we're kind of just showing a little bit of a timeline of what that looks like from 2021 out, for the next 10 years to 2030. So renewable additions are going to occur in the near term. So we have, adding solar and 50 megawatt blocks for the next 5 years. So one of the recommendations that we talked about was issuing a power supply RFP for capacity energy and specifically solar resources. Well, if those, there's nothing that says that if those bids don't come back as very attractive, that LUS can't choose to expedite and move some of these power blocks up, some of these 50 megawatt power blocks up, if it chooses to do so. What we are doing is just looking at the overall addition of 250 megawatts across the next 5 years. Obviously, and then 2027, RPS2 is retired from coal. And then that's going to trigger the need for a large capacity resource that will need to be replaced here in 2028, just like we kind of chatted about. So now that kind of talked a little bit more about the cost and capacity. So now I want to, shift your mind a little bit more to the energy supply side. And certainly with the retirement of coal, LUS is going to shift from coal to renewables, gas, and market purchases. So we have some text over there that you guys can read, obviously, but I really want to talk to these two graphs. So this graph is showing our time horizon, 2021 to 2024, and it's showing the energy mix as a percent of LUS's customer requirements. So from 2021 until Rodemacher is retired at the end of 2027, and it's retired in 2028, you can see a large majority, and this is simulated, this is not history, this is part of the model simulations. You can see that the model simulation is showing, anywhere from 50 to 80% of LUS's energy could be provided by coal. But then we see a, steep drop off when that unit's retired. You see a small sliver here of energy market purchases. With the addition of that solar generation, you see that the solar resources are starting to come in and providing more renewable generation over the time frame. Once RPS2 is retired from coal generation, in this case, this is for path 1, which is the simple cycle unit, it gets added. You can see that there's a small sliver of natural gas generation here. LUS already owns the LM6000 units, which are peaking resources. This would be adding another simple cycle resource, which is a peaking resource, and they're really, intended to only operate 5 to 10% of the time because they're very inexpensive to install from a capacity standpoint. Their heat rates are a little higher, but they certainly provide a nice energy hedge to market purchases. However, under this case, maybe, this is a little too reliant on energy market purchases. An alternative case would be to utilize the combined cycle, as I mentioned. A combined cycle, you have to pay a little bit more for the upfront capacity cost, if you will, the installation cost. However, you get a much better heat rate and a resource that will effectively offset some of those market energy purchases. So you can see almost one for one, it's cutting down the energy market purchases and being filled in with natural gas from a combined cycle resource. And that's exactly what that's the difference between a simple cycle resource and a combined cycle resource is. A simple cycle resource is there essentially to provide capacity, and you're going to leverage other resources for energy. A combined cycle resource you're putting in to provide both energy and capacity. Now, one thing to note is a combined cycle resource, the large combined cycle resources where you can gather good economies of scale are too big for LUS to take on alone. They're over 400 megawatts, and LUS is not going to build a 400 megawatt plant. So in order to participate in a combined cycle resource, you have to find a partner, whether it be another co-owner or potentially through a power purchase agreement or something to that effect to note. So now, basically same graph, just looking at it in a pie chart here. What you're going to see is LUS, by retiring the coal-fired generation, it's going to really allow LUS to shape its energy supply in the future. So here is the 2021 resource mix based on simulations. This was coal 80%. You have 8% renewables, 1% coming from gas, and market purchases getting the remainder. Well, that drastically shifts when you look out in 2030. Coal's retired. Now you're looking at a third of your energy under the simple cycle option, a third of your energy coming from renewables, the remainder mainly from market purchases with a little bit from natural gas. If you were to look at the combined cycle resource, now you're almost looking at an even third, a third, a third from renewables, market purchases, and natural gas based on the analysis that was done. So drastically shifting away from coal to other resources. So now what's that look like when it comes to CO2 emissions? So this is a chart showing the CO2 emissions and how much lower LUS will, LUS's carbon footprint will be moving away from RPS2. So the gray shaded area is the carbon emissions, CO2 emissions from Rodemacher to essentially coal. This is, again, is for path 1 with the simple cycle. This is path 2 down here for the combined cycle. And you can see when it comes down to natural gas with a lot of peaking units, they're not producing very much energy, and those resources, really the carbon footprint almost goes to zero from LUS's owned generation. If LUS chose to do a combined cycle, obviously it's going to be a little bit higher of a CO2 footprint compared to the peaking unit, but a drastically lower level compared to where you would be under coal-fired generation. So, LUS's carbon footprint would drastically reduce from its own generation once Rodemacher is retired. So obviously, we're going to be submitting our report to LUS and publishing it, and they'll get it out there. So there'll be a lot more detail and information with a lot more numbers in that will be available for review. Obviously, we wanted to focus on the high-level things through a presentation here. So really kind of wanted to wrap up and kind of come full circle with the conclusions that we saw. And really, the analysis indicates moving away from coal generation towards renewables and market purchases is going to provide lower cost option compared to where LUS is currently right now with maintaining coal-fired operation. I kind of alluded to this, but the plan is going to provide flexibility and diversity. There's going to be a mix of both dispatchable gas-fired resources as well as renewable resources in there. LUS is going to continue to be positioned to be able to leverage those low capacity costs in the short term. Capacity costs are low. Being a little bit deficit to the full need will allow LUS to continue to buy those capacity purchases at a fairly low level. And then really, by being also a little bit deficit and when I say deficit, you're not building or contracting all the way up to that peak demand area, but really going to be positioned to potentially add emerging technologies once they're more widespread, mature, and cost-effective, whether that's energy storage, whether that's offshore wind, or any other, who knows what will be invented in the next 10 years with all the research and development going on. So LUS will be positioned to continue to evaluate those and potentially add those emerging technologies once they're more mature. And then, finally, the plan is significantly going to reduce CO2 emissions from generation by retiring RPS-2 from coal-fired generation. So, what are the next steps? And we kind of already hit on these, we've shortened them up a little bit back here, but really LUS needs to work with the joint owners to determine what RPS future is and what the potential end-of-life options are for that unit. As you said, there's a lot of approvals that have to go through, so then you're going to have to work with those owners on that. Begin engineering and feasibility studies for repurposing Bonin. Again, we're not saying that that's the plan now, but it takes a long time to do your due diligence on these facilities. So taking a look at engineering and feasibility studies of what it's going to take to repurpose that facility with a simple cycle resource would be prudent. Certainly conduct a power supply request for proposals to potentially procure short-term capacity and renewable energy resources. There's production tax credits and investment tax credits available from the government that are set to expire. You never know what DC is going to do, whether those are going to be extended or allowed to expire. So moving on a power supply request proposal would allow LUS to get bids under those tax credits from third-party entities. Continue to assess rate impacts. I know LUS does this, but anytime you're going to have a major change in your generation portfolio, you're going to obviously want to evaluate the rate impacts associated with that retirement, along with other infrastructure things that are going on, with electric vehicles and renewables and everything else that's going on and other infrastructure improvements that are going on. So just to continue to evaluate that. And then, continue to monitor the overall electric industry with regards to regulations, emerging technologies, and how those are improving, and then continue to review and reassess the power supply plan periodically, just as they've done for several years. So that concludes kind of my talking. I'm going to catch a breath and get a drink, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff.
Thank you, Mike. I think that was a very good summary of the work we've done so far. For this slide, I want to kind of talk about what LUS plans on doing next. We have a number of recommendations, conclusions here, but what do we need to focus on today, tomorrow, immediately? And so the first one is we're going to work with the joint owners to determine the RPS-2 future and potential end-of-life options. Our recommendation will be to retire the unit from coal. We're not quite ready yet to say what happens after that. Do we convert it to natural gas? That would be another joint owner decision. But I think the immediate step is to say we anticipate retiring, we recommend retiring the unit from coal-fired generation and go through those approval processes and applications and things like that. There's a lot involved. It's not just saying we want to shut it off. I mean, there's EPA approvals to make sure that we're compliant with everything that we're doing. MISO has a retirement process for generators. We have to get, regulatory approval as far as governing body approval. A lot of those things. We got to make sure that we're doing it the right way, orderly, neat, and compliant with everything that we're doing. So that would be our first recommendation, is to approach the joint owners and start going through that process of approving moving away from coal. The second step would be analyzing the Dock Bonin site for repurposing and reusing. We retired those units formally in 2017. We put them in economic suspension 3 years prior to that. The site itself is not generating a megawatt today. It houses some of our staff. It houses some of our warehouse and storage area. But we do not generate anything from that site. But what it has is ample fuel supply, gas pipelines. We have major interconnection to the LUS electric system, major electric substation adjacent to the property. It fits if we do want to use it in the future. One thing we don't know is what all our options are for reusing Dock Bonin. And so we want to take a look at everything. The site itself, we've done some clearing recently. remove some oil tanks. We're in the process of deconstructing, demolishing some cooling towers. There's more space. It's a different setup than it has been historically. What can fit? What types of technologies can fit? What are our interconnect options? What are our maximums? That type of thing. So we want to do a thorough assessment of Dock Bone, and not saying we're going to use it for anything, but it's a really good opportunity for us. It may reduce some of our costs in the future for interconnection and fuel supply. So we want to take advantage of it if we can, if the numbers make sense. The last, third step, I guess, of our immediate action plan is to submit an RFP, request proposals. Mike mentioned a moment ago that the recommended path is 50 megawatts a year for 5 years. That doesn't mean we're capped at 50. That doesn't mean we are stuck at 250 over the 5 years. If we want to be flexible, if we want to have options, maybe we submit an RFP for 50 to 100 or 50 to 150, and we still want to stage in. We still want to be a significant purchaser of solar because that's what is going to make the most economic sense for us, but it doesn't have to be 50 at a time. We will have a lot of options with it. We want to be flexible for ourselves, but also be flexible for developers who are going to be submitting bids because they may have certain requirements on their end as well. So those are the immediate three action items, and our goal is to start on this as soon as we can. The joint owners, I don't want to speak on behalf of any of them, but they are aware of our analysis. They are aware of our recommendations, but we have not formalized anything with the joint owners yet. They've just been told more of an FYI scenario. The feasibility study at Bonan can begin as soon as we line up proper contracts and engineering staff to help us analyze those options. And then the RFP. I think we can begin working on drafting the document as soon as we kind of regroup here after this long study process. The goal would be, in an ideal world, to have a contract ready to be signed by the end of 2020. Now, things could change that. It depends on what types of bids we receive and what type of analysis goes into it. But certainly, we could start that process immediately so we can finalize those things. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to have energy delivered day one. The commercial operation date for some of these projects that we're seeing in the different scenarios could be a year or 2 or 3 from now, just depending on what stage they are in the interconnection queue process, planning process, procurement of materials, and so forth. But our goal is to get started on that very, very soon. The other items are important for us. This didn't really, we didn't do a rate study for this IRP. It's not really the focus of it, not within the scope of this, but the rate impact. What is it going to cost to do these different options? Will it require some type of bond issue, capital investment, or is it some type of other purchase power agreement that doesn't require the upfront dollars? It's important for us to continue to look at that. Once we make our decisions more formal, and once we get consensus with the joint owners, and once we make some definite plans of action, we're going to look at the rate analysis. One thing that we do know, though, is running the coal unit beyond 2027 would be the most expensive option that we analyze. All the options, even the ones we haven't thought of yet, are going to be less expensive. And so that's the path that we're going to take. We want to take the most economic option available to us. And so we're going to be taking a close look at rates, available funding, and so forth. The electric utility industry, of course, environmental regulations are a big deal for us. We monitor those constantly. And as soon as rules are handed out or proposed rules are handed down, we do a thorough analysis of those to make sure that we understand the impacts, not only of the coal plant, but also our natural gas-fired plants as well. And of course, we're going to do this IRP process periodically. We're going to I wouldn't say immediately, but every few years, kind of regroup to see what needs to be updated, to understand some of those changes in the environmental world. Also, some technology changes. Do we need to reevaluate or reassess? And so, with that in mind, that concludes our presentation. And now we want to open up an opportunity. We have about 29 minutes here for feedback, to answer questions and an opportunity for feedback. a reminder, we're going to leave the feedback window open for 2 more weeks, July 15th. I've seen some questions come through that I can answer now about when we're going to publish certain things. I hope to have the slide deck published that we're going over tonight in the next day or 2 on our website. We have a dedicated IRP page with everything that we've proposed and presented so far, even going back to last year. So we're going to publish the slides on that page, hopefully in the next day or 2. When is the IRP going to be published? We would like to continue to solicit feedback until July 15th. Make sure that all of our customers' feedback, comments, questions are answered and addressed in the document. And shortly after July 15th, at some point, we will finalize the IRP, and then we will publish it at the same location on our website in the IRP section. And so that kind of gives you an idea of timing of all this. Mike mentioned earlier, this is to give everyone who's participating tonight what our conclusions, recommendations are going to be, and all of that data is going to be provided in our Integrated Resource Plan report. It's a very thorough document with a number of appendices that go over the technology and environmental sections. We really cover a lot in it. I'm proud of this group. I'm proud to work with Burns and Mac on it to come up with such I believe, a good document that helps us make our decisions and make wise decisions. So with that, we do have some questions that were sent in prior to today's presentation. We have a few of them that we've prepared here tonight. If we don't get to your questions tonight, it'll be one of several reasons why. Number one, it may not be in scope, right? So we've got some questions about different rate options and rate analysis. You know, we didn't do a rate analysis in this integrated resource plan. I can answer, though, that we don't have any immediate plans or any pending plans to change our rate structure or have increases or decreases in rates. We're just not there yet. Another thing that a couple other items that were talked about, you know, electric vehicles. Mike mentioned electric vehicles earlier. Just to give everyone an idea of where we are, LUS is actively pursuing PHEV vehicles, you know, right? So we're looking at, we've actually submitted 3 bids in this year, in 2020, and we've gotten 0 responses. And so we're contacting as many dealers as we know that can supply electric vehicles. We're trying to, you know, start slowly and move our fleet in that direction. We're not having much luck yet, but we are giving it our best effort. And so we're gonna attempt it another time or 2, you know, before we have to go to other means of vehicles. But it's in the works. We're trying. As far as deployment of electric vehicle charging stations, you know, we're working with the state right now to get some of the Volkswagen settlement money to install some electric vehicle charging stations around Lafayette. With COVID-19, it slowed down a lot of the processes of just functioning, of getting things taken care of and getting things done. But we are in constant contact with the state for that type of funding, and that's going to give us a really good idea of what the use is going to be, what the penetration rate of electric vehicles is, and so forth. And so, you know, we're all ready to move forward with some of these ideas. Just some things are holding us up. With that in mind, I want to turn it over to Karen Hoyt, who's one of our key members of this team. She's going to read out some of the questions, and either LUS or Burns and Mac will be able to answer these. And then, time permitting, we'll run through the live questions that have been presented, and we'll answer as much as we can. We're on a pretty hard deadline at 7 o'clock our time, so we'll give as much effort as we can until that time. Go ahead, Karen.
Okay, yes, we received several questions either via email or throughout the presentation tonight. The first one we have is, can the renewable purchases happen faster since federal tax credits are set to phase out?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Jeff, if you don't mind. You know, and you can follow up, but I think we already maybe kind of alluded to this a little bit, but, you know, what we were looking at in the model is adding 50 megawatt blocks, you know, for the next 5 years, up to 250 megawatts over the short term. But certainly issuing a power supply RFP, and if LUS were to get, you know, favorable bids back, there's nothing that says you couldn't expedite that sooner and certainly take advantage of those tax credits.
Okay. All right, next question that we have is, how was energy efficiency evaluated?
So yes, we did a detailed evaluation for energy efficiency and demand side management resources in this study, and the full details will be available in the final report. One of the things that we found with that is the cost benefit evaluation did not pencil out based on the program cost associated with implementing those against the benefits that you get. And mainly, right now, capacity is fairly low cost in the market to look at when you're trying to shave off some of that demand. It's fairly economical in the market. And when you look at energy efficiency, the price of wholesale energy has come down significantly. You are seeing more renewables on the system, which get bid in at $0 when it comes to the wholesale energy. You've seen natural gas come obviously way down in price, which has reduced the price of wholesale energy. So when you're looking at the avoided cost to LUS, and spreading that out over a program, the cost benefit evaluation just doesn't pencil out. There are some programs that do continue to make some sense, and LUS is doing that, such as a weatherization program and some other one. I believe another one I can't remember off the top of my head. So LUS will continue to, I think, look at those and see how those can fit in. But right now, those programs just don't necessarily make sense from a cost benefit evaluation. But the future is always changing, and as more and more resources become retired, that cost of short-term capacity may go up, and so all of a sudden now programs may need to be in place in the future, or maybe implemented in the future, that makes sense. But right now, for the foreseeable future, those don't seem to pass the cost benefit evaluation.
Okay. Next question, how is Lafayette planning for electric vehicles?
Yeah, I can answer. I kind of spoke on it a few minutes. Maybe I jumped the gun on it. That's okay. Electric vehicles for us, I've made comments in the past that I think electric vehicles are the next generation's air conditioning systems. It will change how electric utilities provide energy and electricity to its customers. It's also a two-way street, right? There's a lot of feedback involved with electric vehicles because they can become a storage device and supply power to the grid. We've looked at the reports that show how many vehicles in Lafayette area are electric, how many have been sold in the Lafayette area. We're anticipating it to gradually increase over time. That's why we were hoping to work with the state very closely on deploying a few pilot areas for electric vehicle charging. But ultimately, the goal is to set up a policy behind electric vehicles themselves. A number of cities around the country have implemented different programs that vary. Some have installed electric vehicle charging stations around their service territory, and it's free of charge, but you maybe pay for a second meter at your house that's solely dedicated to your electric vehicle itself and the charging. Some have said that, you still pay a small fee. They try to incentivize, electric vehicles to be driven across town, but ultimately charged at night because, there's revenue to be made. And I sat on a panel a year and a half ago, it seems like, about electric vehicles. And the question to me was, what do you see? What's a positive that LUS sees out of electric vehicles? And I said, revenue. And it's the truth, right? We power gas stations today, but we could power the cars directly tomorrow. And so, that's a big deal for us. We want to prepare for it, but we want to be able to present a policy behind it, not just, start throwing out a bunch of electric vehicle charging stations. We want to be smart about it. And I think we can get there. It just may take a little time. It could also may force a change in our rate structure. Incentivize people to charge late at night, early in the morning, off peak, as opposed to getting home at 5 o'clock with their air conditioners full blast and plugging in a electric vehicle that has a pretty good demand on it. So we want to be able to roll that out as well, some type of on-peak, off-peak charging scenario and incentivize people to wait a little later. So there's a lot of that going on. We're doing a lot of it, kind of in the office here, figuring things out. It's slowed down a little bit this year just because of seems like the world is changing a little bit right before us, but we still have those goals in mind. We want to begin implementing some things. It just may take some time. Now, an overall rate change, that would require a little bit longer process because we want to be educators to our customers and not just force a rate on them without prior testing pilot, volunteers to help us implement some type of new rate structure. People are traditional by nature, and when you make a sudden change on your bill, they'll notice and they'll question why. So we want to roll those things out very slowly, but it's being discussed pretty thoroughly here at LUS. It's just a matter of the right time to implement something like that.
Okay, next question we got was asking about how batteries were evaluated.
Yeah,
Mike,
so
yeah,
I can answer that one. So we, took a look at a battery storage option. Right now, the industry is coalescing around in order to get full capacity credit, you have to have around 4 hours of energy storage. So what that means is if you have a 1 megawatt battery, you have to have 4 megawatt hours of storage in that battery to get full capacity credit. This is emerging technology. Batteries have so many different uses on the system, whether it's voltage regulation, demand response, capacity, energy storage, all these different use cases. And it's really, really, an interesting technology because it's both a load because you have to put megawatt hours into it, but it's also a generator, which means it's, can displace generation as well and generate, quote unquote, generate. So battery storage, we evaluated it independently. However, we know that there's a lot of solar developers and wind developers and other folks that will evaluate those, and we within a proposal where they will submit solar backed up with energy storage, for example. So one of the things that will be done in the power supply RFP is, I'm assuming will be done, and obviously it's LUS's choice, but what we would recommend doing is looking at any type of renewable projects that would either be independent or potentially combined with solar plus storage options to allow developers to bid in options that may be able to firm that up more with solar development.
Okay, now we'll move to some questions that we got throughout the presentation. First one we have is, why does LUS have to get away from coal?
Jeff, you want to take that one, or you want me to?
Yep, I'll answer that one. There's no requirement to get away from coal. I guess that's the way I would initially start that, by saying that since 1982, Rodemacher's been in operation. It's been a very productive unit for us and the other two owners. We've benefited from having that unit. It's provided us with a number of opportunities and a number of financing possibilities throughout LUS's history. What I would say to that is that we don't have to get away from coal, but the ultimate path that's shown before us is it's the most economic move we could make. We know that beyond 2027, for the reasons Mike presented earlier, beyond 2027, it could really be costly for us to continue operating the coal plant. What we recommend for our customers is the lowest cost path forward. That also satisfies environmental compliance and other things as well. But there's no requirement for us to move away from coal. It's just that remaining a coal burning unit beyond 2027 would be a very expensive option, and there are less costly options available.
Okay, we'll move on to another question. This one says, LUS already owns and operates several simple cycle natural gas power plants. How often are they used in the MISO market?
I'll take that one, Jeff. So that is a very, very good question. I will say they're used in the MISO market 100% of the time when you're talking about the capacity market. So LUS is mainly using those for capacity resource, which is helping them meet their resource adequacy as spelled out by MISO. So they're being used 100% of the time from a capacity standpoint. However, from an energy side, those resources are not utilized very much. Probably less than 5% of a capacity factor of 5% or less than 5% of the time utilization. And that's almost exactly what they're designed for. They are designed to provide reliable, low-cost capacity, and then allow the utility, whoever, in this case LUS, to position itself to buy cheaper energy resources, whether that's from renewable resources, whether that might be from the renewable resources that don't provide the full amount of capacity, or from energy market purchases that we've seen that have been lower cost. However, they provide a very good reliability component where they can be dispatched very quickly into the market if they see load changes, because they can be turned on very, very quickly. They also provide resiliency. Obviously, MISO has a large plan for black start capability and other things, and not the LUS units, I don't believe, are black start, but they also provide local generation that will help to get the grid up quicker in the case of hurricanes coming through. Obviously, Lafayette's in the area of hurricanes, so they provide a resource there. So it really just depends on what market you're talking about in the MISO market when you're looking at energy and capacity. So they are absolutely 100% used mainly for capacity, but they also provide a different function with, less so on the energy side. And this again gets back to not all power plants are created equal. Peaking resources are not designed to provide energy. They're there to provide essentially backup to other energy resources.
I will add to that, Mike. I think you explained it very well. I will add that we do initiate the generation from those 4 combustion turbines here in Lafayette for outage support, maintenance reasons, general grid support when MISO calls upon it. And we've been lucky the last couple of years without having major hurricanes impact our service territory. But if any of our customers recall 2002 Hurricane Lily, we built those generation units right after that storm passed through, because we did go completely dark, and having local generation in times of need, in times of recovery efforts, is very valuable. So I think they're worth every penny we've paid for them, because they're really great to have for the times when you need them. And so I would add to your comments, but you're right. I mean, as far as being dispatched in the energy market, they are peaking units, and we do dispatch them on very hot days and very cold nights. So they are utilized. It's just they don't run as much as more of a combined cycle or a base load unit would in the market itself.
Okay, next question we got was about possibility of community solar.
Yeah, Mike, I can answer this one. We've done some review and analysis. This IRP, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, we looked at utility scale, and community solar is a little bit less than the utility scale that we've looked at. But we've done our own diligence or due diligence on community solar. About 4 or 5 years ago, we were really seriously looking at community solar, seeing if we could have customers sign up specifically to buy into a small, 2, 3, or 5 megawatt facility. We did a customer survey, and the customers at the time said that renewables is our direction. We should pursue that, but they weren't quite ready to pay extra. And some of the community solar pricing we got at the time was a little higher than what our traditional rates were. And so we haven't pursued it, but what our goal is with this recommendation and the path that we're setting to incorporate 250 megawatts of solar. That's over half of our resource requirements. Major deal here. I hope that would get us to a point where, we're looked at as a moving forward utility, that we're incorporating renewables, we're doing things that for the good of our customers by doing such a massive renewable look-see, purchase. So as far as the interconnection of any utility, solar or community solar, depending on the voltage level of interconnection, if it's below certain voltage thresholds for the interconnection, LUS would completely control that process. It's done in-house. We haven't formalized it yet because we haven't gotten many requests for that, if any. But as far as the utility scale interconnection, that would have to go through a MISO interconnection queue process, and that could take 18 months to 36 months. But if it's injected on the lower voltage levels, then I think that LUS would be able to control that process and perform an interconnection that way.
Got a couple of questions on the possibility of RPS-2 being retired from coal sooner than 2027.
Mike, I can answer that if from a policy perspective at LUS, we have a lot of considerations to think through. First of all, this is a jointly owned unit, and we have to make sure that the other two owners would be on board with whatever decisions are made at that unit. And so we want to make sure that we don't recommend actions that would be too hasty, that would put them at a disadvantage for something, because we are obligated contractually to jointly own and operate that unit. Another thing that we consider is the cost impact to our customers. Right now, we understand what the costs are for Rodemacher. We understand what the fuel costs are. We understand what the O&M costs are. We understand what the capital costs are. We're not required to make major investments in that unit outside of what Mike mentioned earlier is the CCR compliance. But that's a given no matter what direction we go in, no matter what we do with the unit, whether we retire it today or tomorrow or in 10 years from now, CCR compliance has to be met. So with that in mind, you almost can look at it as a sunk cost. It's happening no matter what we do. Look at everything else that we would have to do at the unit. It's relatively minor compared to constructing a brand new unit or buying into a brand new unit. That would require major capital investment. That would require cash up front, more than likely. If we did a purchase power agreement, we could see some increased cost. So we are very mindful of the costs, all the costs that go into these generating units. And when we did our assessments of Rodemacher and TJ Labe and Hargis-Hebert, we considered all the costs that are factored into it, including known environmental costs. So could it be retired sooner? It's not the lowest cost option for us right now, because anything that we do right now would require additional investment in a path forward. We know that in order to comply with other rules by 2028, we're going to run up against another major investment for environmental reasons. In order to comply with that, we can retire the unit from coal generation. So I don't want to say it's forced upon us, but we have an option. We run the operation from now until the end of 2027 with relatively minor investment. And when we get up to the point where we have to make a decision, invest heavily or retire, we're going to choose retire. But until that point, the economics don't work out for us to drastically move away from coal right now. I will say this, since day one, and CLECO has been a terrific partner in that unit. They're the operator of the unit. We have complied with every environmental regulation and rule that's out there. We have been ahead of the game a lot of times. We have made really good, sound decisions since its commercial operation in November of 1982. We continue to do that today, and we will do that until that unit is no longer operating the way it is. But I would say that it would be a little bit too early for us to move away from coal because it would require, in my opinion, a major investment that we're not ready for yet. Okay, Mike, I think we have just a couple of minutes left. We're going to probably have to stop with that and maybe do some closing remarks if you want to maybe go first.
Sure. Yeah, I again appreciate everybody submitting questions. I know we had a lot of questions, and I think we weren't able to get to all of them today, but I think LUS, Jeff and his team and our team will certainly have many of these answered within the report, the details in the final report that you guys will be able to review in the coming weeks. And certainly any of them that maybe were a little bit, like Jeff kind of said, outside the bounds of the scope, or on the gray area out there, that we can follow up in written form later. But really, I appreciate everybody listening. I know this probably wasn't the easiest way to do it. I'd much rather be in person doing this, but obviously the world's changed a little bit, and I'm glad that we were able to present this, and glad to have helped LUS out with this. So with that, Jeff, anything?
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. And I said at the beginning of the presentation that you and your team have been really great during this process. Educated us, helped us along the way, received our feedback. I think we really worked well collaboratively on this to come up with these conclusions. And I have to compliment the LUS staff as well, from the very, very early on, fully engaged. And I will say that only 2 of us had participated in previous integrated resource plans as thorough as this one. So we had a lot of new members, a lot of fresh eyes, a lot of fresh perspective, and I think that helped us along the way. So we had a full staff dedicated to this process. I also have to thank our customers, everybody who's participating tonight, and in the previous meetings we've had, everybody who submitted comments and questions. It helps give us an idea of what our customers truly want out of the system. I hope that we've satisfied everyone's Q&As tonight and in previous meetings. I know that sometimes the integrated resource plan can be complicated, but hopefully we can simplify it enough that we can all make good decisions going forward. Speaking of going forward, I think I obligated LUS a few months ago to make a presentation to the City Council. We'll see where that goes. I do think though that the 3 recommendations is what we would ask the City Council to consider, maybe giving us a thumbs up by resolution or something like that. But between now and the 15th, please, everybody on the phone, submit questions, submit comments and feedback. And as Mike said, we will incorporate all of the comments that we can in the IRP, make sure everything's addressed, and then we can publish it. And then even beyond that, if anybody has any questions about the report itself, they can always contact me. But again, thanks to everybody who's participated throughout this year and a half process, and we look forward to making these things happen. It's going to be an exciting time for us, and I believe LUS and our customers are ready to do it. So thanks, everybody.